All right, so I've got my brand new motherboard here, and I want to go ahead and install it into this case of mine. Now, I've taken some time. I went ahead and I've actually installed the power supply already. I verified that this is a good power supply to work with my motherboard. And I've got my case pretty much ready to go. So what I want to do first here is let's do a quick tour of a typical motherboard so that we can appreciate some of the things we can run into. So first of all, here's my big I/O area. And I have an I/O faceplate for them. It came with the motherboard. So that's good. And we just come looking around. Now, I could pull out a motherboard book, but I've been looking at these for so many years, I can usually figure out most everything. So as we come along here, these are audio connectors. I can get my sound from speakers here, but this will allow me, like if I have front panel connections for a microphone or headphone, I can plug in here. This is for optical media. I can use this if I want to put a music CD into my system. I can play it that way. I have no idea what that's for. These are USB connectors. I want to show these to you a little bit closer. What I have right here is a USB, we call these dongles, just generic terms for something that fits in the back that you connect your motherboard into. And these are extra USB ports. I've got all the USB ports on the back of my system, but I can use these very standardized connectors, and I can plug this into the back, and I've got some USB ports in the back. If I've got USB ports in the front, the case will probably have connectors that allow me to plug into these different things. So marching along here, all of these connectors right here, these are for things like my reset switch, my hard drive light, my power switch, my LEDs for the system being on, my internal speaker, all that's there. This little jumper clears my CMOS. There's my battery. I've got two high-speed SATA connectors here, and although you can't see them from where you're at, if I plug in this way, I got 4 more SATA connectors here. I've got extra fan connectors for my case and system. There's my power, RAM, and everything else is looking good. Okay, so I've already tested this motherboard. I put the CPU and the fan on, I snapped in some good RAM, I plugged it into a power supply, threw in a video card, and plugged that into a monitor without putting it into the case. I just wanted to see if the thing would boot up. It's a lot easier to deal with badly mounted CPUs and RAM and such before you put the system into a case. Plus, I'm a little bit superstitious. Now, if I go into the box that my motherboard came with, there's going to be a few pieces that better be here. In particular, there's going to be my I/O plate. I'm going to throw the junky one that came with the case out, and I'm going to drop this in. These are pushed in from the inside, so you always remember to put these guys in very, very first. So I've got that in. The other big one is your motherboard book. All those little jumpers that I don't know what they're there for, before I actually put this in, I'm going to take some time and really, really read this so I know where everything is. I don't want to mess with any of this in the future, or especially when everything's all screwed down. So I'm going to take some time. You know, for me, this is fun reading, so I'll read the motherboard book cover to cover. The other thing that better be in here are the driver's disc. This disc contains all the drivers for all the built-in peripherals on the system. Without this, I'm probably not going to get the system to run. So I need this guy really, really bad. The other thing you'll see in the box is they'll usually come with hard drive cables, sometimes, heaven forbid, old floppy cables. You'll get crazy dongles like these. All kinds of stuff tends to be thrown into that motherboard box. You end up using about a third of it. And usually, do I have? Excellent. There's always a bag of screws, too. So now that I've gone through all this, the next big step is to let's go ahead and start mounting this. So let's go ahead and mount it. Okay, so I've got all the cables out of the way. Now, these are standouts. They actually lift the motherboard up from the case itself. The screw positions are pretty much standardized for all the different form factors, but I've thrown a few in, and I'm guesstimating just because I've done way too many of these as to where the standouts go. So I'm going to put this guy in. Now usually what you got to end up doing is you got to actually push it up against the I/O faceplate. And what I'm doing is I'm looking around. There's only 5 screw holes. This is actually a very small number of screw holes on this particular motherboard. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm looking as I push it in, and I can see the standouts appearing underneath every single one of these. So I'm happy that I've got that in. Now, what I want you to do is see if you can see this. I'm going to put that down right there on the cooling fan, let you give it a chance to focus in on that. These are these little washers. Now, these washers are supposed to electrically isolate the motherboard from the case. There's a lot of question mark on these. My rule is this. If the motherboard comes with a bunch of screws with these little washers on them, I'm going to use it. So I'm going to go ahead at this point and I'm going to put it 1 screw in. That's all I want to do for my first shot here. There we go. Now everything's in nice and snug. I'm happy. Okay, the first thing we need to install are all of our front panel switches. So they call it switches, but it's more than switches. So we've got our power on switch, our reset switch, we've got our hard drive activity light, we've got our speaker. All of these guys need to be plugged into the motherboard somewhere. It's not always instantly obvious where they go, so I actually had to look it up in the motherboard book, and I found exactly where I need to plug all this stuff in. So I know where to plug it in now, and I'm going to have to go in and start doing some plugging. These are a real pain, just for the record. What you're starting to see on a lot of motherboards now is you get this little device, and the idea is you plug all of your devices into this guy, and then he just drops right into the motherboard. Yeah, well, unfortunately, this is not for this motherboard, so I have to go in and do it the hard way. The other thing we have to deal with are things up in the front. I've got USB, FireWire, and I've got a microphone and a headphone jack. And that's what all of these cables are for. This guy right here is the audio for the front, the speakers and the microphone. This one's pretty easy. There's a plug-in, and it looks very similar to the USB. He has a particular spot he plugs in. It also has a second set in case you're using a non-standard plug. Here I've got USB. I hate these where they're individual singles like this. I'm going to have to really go through the motherboard carefully, and I'm going to have to plug these in individually. I much prefer these. These are actually identical. Keep in mind that this one jack supports 2 physical ports. This is just for 1 port here. We'll get that plugged in. This is an old FireWire port. I'm not even going to bother plugging it in. So I'm going to have to sit here for a minute and get all this stuff wired in. A couple of things you need to remember. The most important thing is your front LEDs. You've got a power LED and you have a hard disk drive activity LED. On those little LEDs, there's a colored wire and then there's a black wire. You actually have to have these oriented properly. If you don't orient them properly, you won't break anything, they just won't work. You're going to have to turn them around and plug them back in. So I'm going to take a minute, let me get all this stuff plugged back in, and I'll show you the end result of my labors. Okay, everybody, here's the moment of truth. Got the video card in, got my keyboard plugged in, I've got it hooked up to this monitor right now, and this is the big one, so everybody ready? 1, 2, 3, here we go. I hate this part. This is the first real boot we're going to try this system on. So I'm just waiting. This can take anywhere from 15 to 30 seconds depending on the system. And I'm really hopeful everything's going to be working right. I've got my beep, so I'm pretty sure that I posted out just fine, but I'd sure like to see something up on the screen. And that, my friends, is a successful motherboard installation. Now, keep in mind that we don't have any storage devices or anything installed at this point, so it's going to give me an error. But that's a great error. It's going to say no boot device. I'm glad to see that, because I'm going to be installing my hard drives and my optical media and all that next. But right now, I know I got a good motherboard.